Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on behalf of GGI IU and the GCF IU. It's really wonderful to be here today. This is actually the first time we're going to be joining the two IUs. And I'm also joined by Karina Angelou from the Global Resilience Partnership, Mike Ward from Climate Investment Funds, and Sanjay Bhatia from the UNDRI. So, and my name is Hannah. If you're not too close. Sorry, I'm a bit close here. My name is Hannah. I'm the male officer for GGI IU. I've been in GGI for 4 years now. I've grown into my position and I'm very honoured to be leading today's discussion and moderating the discussion with our panel of experts. So why are we here exactly? We have the word transformative in our Global Green Growth Week name, fast-tracking transformative climate action. But this kind of concept of transformation or transformational change, it's a big word. And I think we can all agree that this is where we're all trying to lead to, but we maybe don't agree on what it looks like, what defines it, and even trickier, how to measure it. So this is why we are joined by leading experts in the field to help us unpack or decode, as we've put it in the title, this notion of transformational change. So just a quick run through of my dear speakers and what they do. First, we'll hear from Mike Ward. I don't know if you can see him on camera. I can't see him. Yes, at the top there. Mike is a senior sustainability specialist. Thank you for waving, Mike. With over 25 years at the intersection of sustainable development, learning and change. And he leads the Climate Investment Fund's Transformational Change Learning Partnership, working on just transitions and strategic program evaluations. I understand that Mike and Martin, who I have here to my right-hand side, they work closely together. So they'll be presenting in the first part of our session today, giving you the broader framework for transformational change. And as I mentioned, Martin, he's an evaluation specialist from the GCF Independent Evaluation Unit. He holds a PhD from the University of Manchester. Just give a wave for everybody. Well, thank you so much. Working at 4 leading European universities with 15 years of experience in international development, so also an expert in the field, and an editor at the European Journal of Development Research. Then I have to Mike's right, I have a colleague, Karine Velache. She's going to be our voice of youth today. So she'll have an intervention at the end, giving the youth perspective on what we should be doing for transformational change and to achieve it. As well, online, I have Karina Angelou, who I mentioned briefly before. Thank you, Karina. Karina is the Strategic Learning Lead from the Global Resilience Partnership and oversees strategy development, implementation and learning reporting cycles. She just published a chapter an excellent chapter, part of her PhD dissertation. And I highly recommend you contact her on LinkedIn to get that. And you just finished your PhD, I understand, in environmental policy from the Imperial College London. And then I have Mr. Sanjay Bhatia. He is sitting in Incheon, in the Incheon office for UNDRI, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. I'm sorry, that's such a mouthful, so that's why I wanted to use the acronym. He's a training expert, having trained over 8,000 professionals in the hopes that this would lead to resilient cities and urban resilience. And he has 30 years of experience in disaster risk reduction. So also another expert on for our discussion today. Just some logistical notes.
I would like everybody online and offline in the room to have their phones ready, because we're going to do a word cloud in Mentimeter. So you will have to connect and click the link or the code that will come up on the screen. So just be ready for that at about halfway. I'll let you know. We have interpretation in French and Spanish for anyone whose native language is not English or is not proficient in English. We have that. And I will also be receiving and monitoring questions in the chat. And I will try and integrate those into our discussion. And I'll definitely do my best to make that as more natural as possible. And if time allows, I will take some questions from our audience sitting in Seoul. And also just a special shout out to my online speakers, Corinna and Mike. They are sitting in different parts of the world, and it's very early for them, especially Mike. So thank you very much for joining. We really do have an international panel today. Great. So the first part is frameworks for understanding transformational change. So Mike will open on the frameworks from the TCLP, and the CIF. So Mike, you have the absolute power to present and control your presentation.
And thank you very, very much for the introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be joining everybody. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and the various inputs. So I'll chat a bit on transformational change. And I suppose the first question really is why this discussion on transformational change, beyond having it in the title. And for me, this one image really kind of highlights the importance of transformational change. Up on the kind of top right of the graph, we see two sort of blue little triangles, and those really are the policies and actions, the pledges and the targets that countries have set through their nationally determined contributions. The green triangle dropping down way below that is what 1.5 degrees compatible looks like. And the two big arrows are really the difference between the small incremental changes that we're making in the blue sections and what we really need to be doing in the green. And for me, that is where this difference sits between incremental change and transformational change. So we really need transformational change to get to 1.5 degrees. And so a number of people, about 600 individuals and 250 odd institutions, have been working together for the last 6 years through the Transformational Change Learning Partnership. They come from many different sectors. Don't worry about the detail on the kind of stakeholder mapping on the right. I think what is significant is that many of the people work in the global north still on transformational change, or they're based in the global north, and many of them work in the global south, and then many people based and work in the global south. So a real need to kind of open up this discussion across both north and south. But it has been lively discussion, and through that work really have developed a set of definitions. So trying to define what transformational change is, trying to identify dimensions or attributes of transformational change that would need to be present in order for us to kind of be confident that genuine transformational change is happening. And then we're using questions, and I'll share a little bit on the questions that try and kind of probe and help us to understand what it is that should be happening in each of those dimensions. And then I think that this will be picked up in the discussion, particularly around measurement, but it's not kind of quantitative measurement. It's more a qualitative assessment of what we're achieving in terms of transformational change. Is it just emerging? Is it more advanced in different contexts? And so we work with this notion of signals, and I'll share some thoughts on those. So just to start with the definition of transformational change, I think that most people kind of find the first bit of that fundamental change in systems. People often talk about systems change with large-scale positive impact. So that kind of systemic change, large-scale, is relatively uncontested. The thing about that part of the definition is that it's relatively agnostic about what the change actually achieves. And so we've quite consciously introduced a number of normative aspects that shift and accelerate the trajectory of progress towards climate neutrality, inclusivity, equity, resilience, and sustainable development pathways. And I think that it's these normative aspects that really need to be given much more attention as we think about transformational change, and to ask what change would look like if we took those things seriously. If we took equity really seriously, what would the change look like? So that's a definition. Across that definition, a number of dimensions, 5 dimensions that have been identified through the TCLP as needing to be present to some degree in any change for us to say that it is transformational. So the first dimension is around relevance. It's the alignment with and attentiveness to the goals and context through time. So it's really the issue of understanding context and ensuring that there's alignment between the kinds of need that we have, the plans and policies that we're putting in place, and how we're going about achieving them. The second big dimension is systemic change, which is really fundamental system change. Speed, it's the acceleration, but not just the acceleration. It's around achieving the appropriate speed of change, and I'll come back to what that appropriateness may mean. Scale, contextually large, so what is large in maybe a country like South Africa in terms of, for example, the number of miners being affected by the change, would not be large in a country like India, and so we need to take context into account. And then this notion of adaptive sustainability. How do we kind of learn our way into what is not yet there and continuously respond to change as it happens? So those are the dimensions. People often battle to work with them and say, well, what does that mean in the context that I'm working in? And so we've been using questions, and the usefulness of questions sits around the fact that where we're trying to bring about transformational change, we're often dealing with very specific situations. Those situations are often complex. They're very often contested. Different groups have different interests, and they're emergent, so they're changing over time, which means that we really don't know all of the answers. And so we're needing to engage in dialogue all the time. And the questions create a flexible guidance for transformative program design, implementation, review, and learning. So throughout a kind of program or project lifecycle. So what do those questions look like? At a very high level, we've kind of simplified them into, if we're thinking about relevance, what is required in a particular context, what is planned, and are they aligned? So I've put up some images on the right-hand side there. This is the South African kind of just transition work that's going on at the moment, particularly around big processes like the Just Energy Transition Partnership, the JETP. And so we've looked very carefully at what do we set out in, for example, our National Development Plan or our nationally determined contributions, and then thought through as the kind of big JETP $8.5 billion was kind of put into the just transition in South Africa, started to ask, well, what are we planning? And is what is needed and what is planned really aligned? So that was the question of relevance. Then we ask, in terms of systemic change, what systems need to change and how do they need to change? And then very importantly, who needs to be involved and how? And it's really a part of the question around procedural justice. How do we ensure that those people that are most vulnerable and will be most affected are involved in deciding which systems need to change? If we decide that it's a technological system, then we kind of tend to involve engineers. If we recognize it as an issue of access and equity, then a whole lot of other different players get involved. So yeah, what systems need to change? Where do we draw the system boundaries is often a political decision, and who's involved in those decisions. And then what is the relationship between urgency and complexity? This is I suppose the big just transition question as well. And we recognize that there's an urgent need for change to phase out or phase down coal. but there's complexity in terms of the workers, communities that are impacted, countries that are impacted in those processes. So speed is both urgency and complexity. Scaling, what scaling is required? Is it kind of vertical scaling around policy and implementation? Is it horizontal scaling in terms of geographic area and number of people being involved? Is it a kind of depth scaling in terms of understanding and support? So different kinds of scaling that need to be grappled with. And then what capacity needs to be built? So this adaptive capacity in order to achieve sustainable development pathways in an ongoing way as issues emerge. And so we've been asking all of these questions around things like the just energy transition work, but in many of our other programs as well across the Climate Investment Fund. So here's just a little bit of an example. Those questions are then kind of fleshed out. So when we start to have a look at, for example, speed, this is just one, I'll just give an example of it. So as we start to work on something like the Accelerating Coal Transition, a big program of the Climate Investment Funds, on speed, we'll ask what will it take to achieve a transition away from coal in a time frame that aligns with the urgency and complexity of the climate crisis. And it's an open question to be discussed with stakeholders in the various countries that are looking at working on the Accelerating Coal Transition. We look at acceleration. How does the intervention accelerate progress towards a coal to clean transition? And then we look at complexity and inclusivity. How does the intervention ensure adequate and inclusive engagement with complex and contested issues associated with the phase out or phase down of fossil fuels? And so these questions help us to kind of probe what needs to happen in a particular situation. And we have questions like these around each one of the dimensions. So in South Africa, just a quick example, the grey bit at the back are the large coal-fired power stations in the country. And when we start to think about the speed of closing those coal-fired power stations, which is kind of where they peter out on the right-hand side of the graph, we've got one set that kind of says this is what we're planning as a country. What is needed is quite different. So a 2-degree compatible and least cost is the red arrow, significantly accelerated. And so that kind of modeling helps us to understand how can we accelerate the change to reach a kind of at least 2 degree Celsius temperature rise, and be the least cost, and at the same time have this ambition of leaving no one behind, so the just transition work. So it's this kind of long-term modeling that helps us to understand the situation and then to ask questions around speed in this instance. The problem with the questions is that the answers that you get often depend more on people's understanding and interests than necessarily directly what is needed. And so this notion of signals, can we use some kind of way of understanding how quickly change needs to happen in order to kind of monitor and track it and evaluate it? So the signals are the changes that we'd expect to see as transformational change advances in specific contexts. So we might talk about emerging transformational change or more advanced transformational change. And are really useful for tracking the progress. And so we've used these signals in different ways. And this is just an example of how the questions on the left start to be converted into signals of change, both around outcomes. So the O's referring to the kind of outcomes that we would expect to see at a kind of emerging level. The required pace of coal transition has been identified and aligned with the country context. And then a more advanced is that it's kind of aligned with the global needs and global commitments. And then the kinds of processes. So what signals would we expect to see in terms of processes of both the acceleration, but also inclusivity and, as I've said, kind of procedural justice, social inclusion work. And then we've also used them in evaluations. This was a large external evaluation of our scaling up renewable energy program in low-income countries, SREP, and just the same framework being used and comment made on to what extent was the program relevant, to what extent to support systemic change. So just using these dimensions in evaluations. So yeah, I think maybe I'll leave it there, hand back to Hannah, and then very happy to take up some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. So I have some key takeaways from your presentation, from what you were saying, and what I definitely took away was that although we don't know all the answers, we should be asking these questions. And I guess the answers and measuring the answers, that's really the tricky bit. And I really enjoy the way that you've framed the signals and broken it down, basically broken the definition of transformational change down further into emerging and advanced. So this kind of progression of change. So I think that was excellent. So I'm going to hand over now to Martin, not as a response, but as another framework for transformational change from the GCF-IU.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and also Helgi, for the opportunity to come and present on this panel. Today, my name's Martin Prowse, Evaluation Specialist from the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. It's a real privilege to be able to present today alongside Mike, Corinna, Sanjaya, and also my colleague Karin Valash here, also from the IU. So to summarise, what does the IU do? Well, we deliver high quality evidence to inform policies to lead to high impacts. And how do we do that? Well, we discharge the two functions that the unit has. First, an accountability function. We hold the GCF Secretariat accountable by reporting directly to the board. And secondly, we fulfil our learning mandate. We make sure that the GCF evolves as a learning institution to making sure that the GCF is informed by the latest evidence, and this is fed into projects and programming and processes within the unit. Today, I'm privileged to be able to present two ways that we've approached the issue of transformational change. So Mike's outlining the landscape of transformational change as understood by the TCLP, the Transformational Change Learning Partnership. A very large and active community of practice in terms of climate finance, and within and across climate funds, donor agencies, NGOs, private sector firms. And I'm going to present two ways that the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund has also started to tackle some of these questions about how we've framed transformational change and about the results that we've had. So Mike's outlined that a number of terms are usually bounded around at this point: systemic change, just transition, transformational change. The Green Climate Fund is mandated to support sort of low emission and climate resilient development pathways in developing countries through supporting mitigation and adaptation projects, and to do so in a way that takes into account the developmental needs of developing countries, particularly vulnerable countries that are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Moreover, the recent updated strategic plan of the GCF outlines support for a paradigm shift across key sectors: energy, infrastructure, transport, and ecosystems. And also the GCF is now incorporating an evolving understanding of just transition and just and equitable transitions, just and equitable transition pathways, I should say. So we can see the evolution of these terms within the GCF, as currently the term used in the governing instrument is the paradigm shift. But originally, when the governing instrument was being negotiated, the term transformational change was being bounded around, but they settled on paradigm shift for the governing instrument. And now we're seeing the GCF programming documents shift much more towards just and equitable, or evolving understandings of just and equitable transition pathways. So we can see there's shift and some movement here in how the GCF is understanding transformational change. I'm going to present very quickly two pieces of work. So the first of these assesses the degree to which the GCF's project portfolio is likely to lead to transformational change. And this is based on self-reported data by accredited entities from 125 funding proposals. And it's based on data that the Independent Evaluation Unit extracted through its IU data lab. So we pulled out all of the information and data from the 125 proposals as of March 2020 to complete this piece of work. we compared the data across two frameworks for that for us feed into transformational change. First, six steps of innovation. So these start with innovation, but you go through the steps of proof of concept, piloting, scale up and replication to a paradigm shift. You find that innovation risk goes down as you go through time towards a paradigm shift, but implementation risk increases as you go through time. So these are 6 steps of innovation. So this forms the framework for the conceptual framework that we used. We applied to that 8 components of transformational change. So Mike has outlined the components of transformational change used within Transformational Change Learning Partnership, which are fantastic and function very well at the level of that large community of practice. In this work, we were slightly more granular, and we went through the funding proposals and the data sets that the IU Data Lab created, and we thought, okay, what metrics can we use? What variables can we use here to use as proxies for components of transformational change? And these are innovation, scale, depth, coherence and complementarity, especially between donors, demonstration ability, behavior change, policy change, and permanence. So then we put those 2 aspects, innovation and components of transformational change, together into this framework. And you'll see that some of the aspects of transformational change support the later aspects of innovation in terms of coherence and complementarity fits very closely with scaling up and replication across climate funds and by donors. Policy change is really what we're looking for after evidence has been accumulated and we feel that the paradigm shift is taking place. On the other hand, demonstration ability and behavior change, we felt fitted much more closely to the early stages of innovation. So we then went to the data sets and we extracted data and cleaned the data sets and we standardized the variables. We made sure that the variables were suitable for cluster analysis. So this is a data organization technique. And it essentially maximizes intra-cluster similarity. And so we created all of these variables, which are either binary or null, and we reconfigured them so they're all scale variables. And then we conducted k-means cluster analysis, which allows you to stipulate the number of clusters. And we then assessed that across the 3 thematic areas of the GCF: adaptation, cross-cutting, and mitigation. And I've put on the slides there the steps that we went through. No need to go into those steps right now. But in the end, we ended up with standardized scale variables, and we removed any outliers and made sure that it was a robust data set to work with. So what we found was that the cluster that had the highest potential for transformational change within the GCF portfolio had the highest number of projects within it were adaptation projects. We also found the same for the cluster that showed medium potential for transformational change, and we found, that cluster had a very high number of adaptation projects followed by cross-cutting. So when we looked at the projects that were included within the highest paradigm shift potential cluster, they illustrated aspects of permanence, policy change, demonstration ability, and complementarity and coherence. Whilst in the medium cluster, these projects scored highly in terms of permanence, scale, and behavior change. So when we fitted that together with our conceptual framework, we felt that this dovetailed quite nicely, and we were surprised at this. The reason for this is, in terms of those projects that were in the high cluster the high potential cluster for transformational change, they illustrated dimensions of policy change and complementarity and coherence, as well as permanence and demonstration ability. But the first of those, CNC and policy change, they really at the late stages of the steps of innovation. And so we felt that and we made that point in the article that we published from this, that we felt that there was a good degree of coherence there. So that was the first piece of work that I wanted to throw into the discussion. And I can also follow on with the second piece of work, and I'll do that very, very rapidly so that I don't take up too much time. I'm just going to make sure that the slides are back in full. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. So the second piece of work that I'm going to describe to you very, very quickly is based not on the GCF project portfolio, but on a global evidence review that we conducted in the Independent Evaluation Unit alongside the climate investment funds. So specifically alongside Neha Sharma, a very close colleague of Mike's in the CIFs. And here we looked for examples of transformational change in two sectors, in energy and in the public health sector. And so it was quite an ambitious review, and we tried to contribute to debates on transformational change by including a very, very wide range of interventions and outcomes in energy and public health sectors, and also combining two different outputs, evidence gap maps alongside systematic reviews. So we lay out the landscape of studies with interventions in rows and outcomes in columns for those two sectors, and then we selected key particular cells within those evidence gap maps that we did meta-analysis on. And the inclusion criteria for the study were based on, well, in today's presentation, we're just going to focus on energy, just the results from the energy sector. So we're trying to find out what causal evidence exists on transformational change within the energy sector to inform mitigation and adaptation. And we define transformational change across three dimensions: depth, scale, and duration. So depth, this is the measured effect sizes from the causal studies. Scale, in terms of scope or coverage of beneficiaries. And data collection, that's the length of time after the intervention had taken place that the effects were measured. So these criteria helped us find studies for transformational change. We applied what's known as the PICO framework, the Population Intervention Comparator Outcome Study Framework. So we included studies with at least 1,000 beneficiaries. We looked at four types of interventions for energy: institutional and market interventions, incentives and standards, soft interventions, so behavioral science nudges, and investments in infrastructure. We only used causal studies, so experimental or quasi-experimental studies. And we looked at the following outcome areas: mitigation, adaptation, labour market co-benefits from the investments or the transition to renewable energy. And this is for energy specifically. And as I said, we only included causal studies at least 1 year after the onset of the intervention. It's the theory of change that we used. We use these widely in the unit. We find them a very powerful tool. And here we see the sub-interventions and the sub-outcome areas that we also used within the evidence gap map. So the literature assessment was done by pairs of coders, and any discrepancies were verified by a third party. And we constructed the EGM to document where the evidence lies and where the gaps are within the evidence base. And to repeat again, we selected key cells within the evidence gap map to do a meta-analysis on. And that's essentially when we aggregate the effect sizes across a number of interventions, so we get more precision in the effect sizes, and the confidence intervals get narrower. So we started off this exercise. We worked with the Centre for Evaluation and Development in Germany. It was co-funded by the Climate Investment Funds and the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. We started off with 8,000 or just under 9,000 studies. 7,000 were screened at title and abstract level. We only included, I'd say 269 for full text screening. That's because most of the articles are out of scope. 96 were retained at that stage and for the EGM, and 31 were included for the systematic review. So this is an example of the EGM, and hopefully we'll be able to share this in the chat for the meeting. So this is where we have the interventions in rows. We've got the main 4 intervention areas, and for each of those we've got a number of sub-intervention areas, and then we've got the outcome areas in columns. And then if you click on this on the online version of this, you find out those specific. And I think that's just been put into the chat there. So if you click on that particular link that's been put into the chat, and you have the opportunity to go into the EGM, as soon as you click on any of the cells, and the size of the circles denotes the number of studies we have in that particular combination of interventions and outcomes, you'll then have all of the bibliographic information related to those experimental or non-experimental studies. So this is a very powerful resource for project developers. If you're working on a particular energy project and you're looking at institutional and market systems, and your project's focused on a particular form of market integration, for example, you can pull out from this EGM the most recent causal studies on that intervention type across a wide range of different outcome areas. And so it's a powerful resource to use. I will definitely speed up, so we won't take too much time on this. But to round off, we focused on 2 cells for the meta-analysis: the effect of China's pilot emissions trading scheme on greenhouse gas emissions and the effects of electrification on formal employment. I won't go through the second of these because we don't have time, but what we found was that the effects of electrification has a very small positive effect on formal employment. The key caveat is it's especially for women, and that's where all the effect sizes were coming. So there's a very strong gender dimension there when you're considering the effects of electrification on formal employment. And when you think that through, that's quite logical and quite straightforward too. But for the assessment of the pilot Chinese emissions trading scheme, that started, I believe, 2013-14, and we essentially included 12 of the 12 key studies. And we used a meta regression approach, a random effects model, and we did lots of sensitivity and diagnostic tests to make sure that what we were presenting was robust. And what we found out was this: we found a reduction in emissions from the China's pilot emissions trading scheme of 17%, and that's substantial. I mean, it's in terms of the Cohen's D value, which is a metric we used in this paper to assess the size of change. And this is it equates to a Cohen's D value of -1, which is between the conventional threshold for large effects, 0.8, and huge effects of 1.2. And in terms of the sort of 95% confidence in terms of where the range of the effect lies, it ranges between a slight increase of 0.4 and a substantial decrease of 31%. So we ran with the diagnostic tests and checks, and what we found from it was this: is we found some unusual combinations of effect sizes and standard errors. Essentially, the studies indicated that there were potential risks of publication bias. So publication bias means that, for example, journal editors are only publishing significant results. It also means that many of the relevant studies that we have in applied social science, like we work in evaluation units, a lot of the grey material isn't available and isn't integrated. So when we completed a funnel plot here, and we found that many of the effect size and standard error combinations are very close to significance lines, which is a slight warning. And we also found that, you know, studies with very, very large effect sizes, especially one particular outlier, also showed very, very high standard error figures. So, for example, if we take that study out, it reduces the effect size by 4%. So overall, we felt that our best estimate of 17% from the China pilot emissions trading scheme was an overestimate, and it's likely much, much lower than that, possibly between the range of 7% to 10%, something like that. But it's still in the range of a very large illustration of transformational change, which is a topic for today. And with that, I'll hand back to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was really fascinating, and I can see the clear link between your 2 parts, and also the link to Mike's part. So you discussed first what the potential is, and then where does the evidence lie, although there are some risks in this evidence. And I think the signals that Mike spoke about kind of sits in between here, that can kind of help us to measure both the potential and the evidence when we don't necessarily have hard evidence. It's also worrisome a little bit that there is this publication bias. I think we all are aware of that, but that also means that we're not looking at what doesn't work in transformational change, and we're not learning from what doesn't work, and we're kind of becoming a little bit putting the blinkers on, or the blinders on not learning from I guess our failures, and kind of exaggerating our successes. Fascinating. So thank you so much from Mike and Martin in our first part on the frameworks of transformational change. I'm going to do the Mentimeter now. So in the chat, and I also share on the screen, everybody please get your phones out, online, offline, wherever you are in the world. I see we have 58 people online, and I think about 5 of them are us. So we have definitely over 50 people who should get their phones out now. And I will share my screen. How do I do that? I'll present. Here we go. So it's pretty simple. Just join at menti.com through your phone or your laptop and use the code 87796883. I hope everybody can get in. If people in the room can give me a thumbs up if you can enter. Yes, we have something in chat. So the question is, pick your words to define transformational change. I've given you up to 5 words per participant. So we've got some words coming in now. It should, if it does work, although we might have all words looking the same size. If you pick the same word, they should then appear larger. So I see impactful, paradigm shift, sustainable, that's a big one. Can all agree on that. Enabling environment, scaling up, away from business as usual, overestimated. So are we overestimating our transformational change or our potential? Inclusive. I'd like to see some provocative ones as well. So it's all anonymous, don't be shy. Resilience, ownership, revolutionary, political will, misunderstood. I like that a lot. Basically what we're trying to understand today, correct our misunderstanding if we have any. Permanence, all of society. Duration. We already have 75 responses. Safe. Bold. Very interesting. Paradigm. So the big ones coming up are impactful, nexus, inclusive, sustainable, scale. I think I'll give it another 1 or 2 minutes and I will stop live commentating on the words. If I can just ask, Martin, do you have any initial thoughts on the words coming up? Any?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, it's a great exercise. It's really inclusive, and it also gets to see how everyone's interpreting many of the presentations, the discussions, and I think the center of the graphic sustainable, and that's why we're all here. That's why we're all in the room. That's what we're all working towards. But we can also see diverging and very, very broad understandings of what this term relates to, and I think that's very beneficial for us to understand and to work through. To be frank.
Thank you. Excellent. So I'll leave that here for now, but we will come back and visit it again. And you can still, throughout the session, post your words. I'll stop sharing. And I will be passing on to my next speaker, Corinna from Global Resilience Partnership. And she's going to speak to us about outcomes and processes and a specific case of transformational change that they've seen in the GRP. So take it away, Corinna.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Really wonderful to be here and really wonderful to listen in to Martin's and Mike's presentations. Lots of thoughts coming up, and I love seeing the dots connect between what do we really mean by this word transformation, and how do we get our heads around how do we implement this? How do we strive for this? How do we measure it? How do we evaluate it? Taking a step back, and I loved flashing at some point the word resilience was becoming larger and larger. So I was here in my corner going, yes, resilience is, very, very closely linked to this conversation about transformational change. And for those of you who don't know the work of the Global Resilience Partnership, we advance resilience through identifying and scaling innovation solutions on the ground. We generate and share new knowledge, and we are also actively looking at how we might then shift the enabling policy environment as well. So these three areas are the focus of our work. We are just about to turn 10, so that was a good moment for us, a good opportunity to actually take a step back and take stock and ask this question: what have we learned from a decade of implementation as an organization? So perhaps at a different level to the analyses and the context presented by Martin and Mike, but really looking at how do organizations learn, and how do we know whether the work that we are seeking to implement, the work that we are seeking to advance, how do we know that we're having any impact? And I think two things are really key standing out from this exercise. And I also saw them reflected in different ways in Mike's and Martin's presentation. The first one is that transformation and transformational change refers to both a process and an outcome. And I think for our work is really, really important to understand the difference and also the complementarity between the two. So when we talk about transformational outcomes, we need to ask the question, from what to what? And to really understand this process of transformation and how our work contributes to that, is really important to know where you're starting from, what your baseline is, what your systemic diagnosis is. What is it? What is the system that you're trying to shift? How do you define it? What is in scope? What is out of scope? What are the boundaries of the intervention that you're seeking to achieve? And likewise, it's really important to ask this question, to what? And I think Mike really wonderfully summed it up in saying that this question of outcomes is normative. It contains conversations about values, about norms, about behavior, about beliefs. So it's very, very fundamental in underpinning how we see the world and what we would like to see come about in the world. And I think a lot of the times in what we're seeing, and obviously in the world of resilience, the sort of the timeframes that we've had for implementation are shorter than perhaps in mitigation. But I think what we're seeing is this focus on outcomes. And this brings me to my second point, that we must not undervalue the role of transformation as process. So how we intervene. What is the role of governance? And by governance, I mean both the hard aspects of governance, the policies, the frameworks, all of the things that you can see and contain in words, but also the softer aspects of governance, aspects around leadership, around values that we hold as leaders. How do we show up in the world? How do we show up in our work? And what does that mean when we're seeking to organize for transformational change? And I think with these two layers or approaches in mind when it comes to transformational change, we've been undergoing a stocktake exercise to look at what might this mean for our work, what does it mean for our portfolio, and we've identified three key opportunities when we talk about transformational outcomes. And we've been through an exercise of looking at how do we define this shift from what to what. So when we're talking about our work and how we structure our work, these three key outcomes that we are seeking are around regenerative and equitable food systems. So really looking at the role of food and food systems in that, looking at reimagining finance flows and structures. And it is no surprise to anyone in this room, I think, in terms of the increasing calls for bridging the gap in financing for adaptation and resilience. And last and probably most important, this shift in really putting communities at the heart and really shifting from seeing communities as beneficiaries to seeing communities in the driving seat of this transformational change and keeping with the principles of locally led adaptation. So these three areas, food, finance, and communities, are shaping how we are looking at our work going forward, but also how we are looking to intervene. So really looking to understand how do we then, within these three quite broad areas and systems in their own right, how do we then intervene? How do we identify intervention points? How do we know that they have leverage, that we are intervening given the positionality that we have in the resilience system as well, and the role of the partnership, the role of the secretariat within the partnership, and also the wonderful and amazing work of our partners. So over 70 organizations, ranging from donors, private sector, insurance, civil society organizations, humanitarian, climate, aid organizations. So a very, very broad and diverse partnership. And really looking at how we deliver through and with our partners. And I think from this sort of framing around the work that we do and the sort of the orientation that we are taking going forward, I wanted to share an example from our past decade of work that we think demonstrates the qualities of transformational change. So what are we learning from a decade of implementation? What does transformational change actually look like? And I want to bring up the example of the Roads for Water initiative. So this program was started in Ethiopia in 2014. So this is one of our earliest programs that we have supported, led by Meta. And it has since been introduced in more than 15 countries. Different solutions looking at how do we tackle the issue of road runoff damage, so excess water on roads, and how do we shift this into looking at how we might enable low-cost water harvesting, and therefore tackle issues around water scarcity, around drought, around water security. The numbers are not necessarily the important part of the story here, but obviously in this conversation around how do we evaluate and how do we look at transformational change, they are an indicator, they are a signal in terms of the things that we can quantify and the output indicators that we can look at to then better understand and assess, is this transformational? How does this stack up? And one of the ways in which we are looking at portfolio analysis and looking at the initiatives that we have supported over the years is by understanding this transformative potential. And I here see parallels with the work that Mike was presenting around signals and around inquiry questions. And we really put learning at the heart, because we know that is really key to understand what works, what doesn't. But for that, we also need time. You need time to actually understand how do these programs that you might fund and support and incubate or mentor, depending on what the need is, how do they grow and evolve over time? And what has been really interesting, and on the left, you can see the type of transformation potential that we are looking at, the learning questions that are associated with this, and what we are learning from the Roads for Water initiative. So at the first level, we are looking at, is there any evidence of changes in the drivers of system behavior? So this is where we might ask questions around, how do we address drivers? How do we address root causes? How deep and durable are these changes once we are starting to see evidence coming out? And here, in the case of the Roads for Water initiative, we have seen that intercepting damaging floodwater guides it to recharge areas, storage places, farmland, and actually does improve water and food security in what are typically insecure, water insecure regions. This is the first level, where we're looking at the boundaries that are within the direct influence of what the project was seeking to achieve. The second level is asking questions around, are we seeing any changes in the behavior of other system actors? So shifting away from what might be seen as the sphere of control, as what are the parameters and the variables that you can control from the perspective of your program, your project, your intervention, whatever the name might be, but really looking at that influencing layer. And this is where we have seen evidence that the guidelines that the project has developed have now become accepted by the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and are becoming the norm, slowly shifting perceptions in terms of what road engineers see as the norm, in what other experts see as desirable in terms of projects and implementation. And the third layer, and this is perhaps the trickiest, in terms of, are we seeing changes in the overall behavior of the system? Are we seeing, and I think this is where, and I saw in both the previous presentations, hints at paradigm shifts. And I say it's more difficult because obviously understanding paradigm shifts is, the time spans are probably much, much longer when we're looking at shifts that are that deep and at that level. But I think this is where, and to use Mike's words, this is where we're seeing some signals in terms of how these approaches are being adopted in national policies, about the scaling of implementations, so going from one pilot country to now over 15, and also understanding what might be the scaling potential when we're looking at the estimated investment that will be going into road development on the way to 2050. And a different way of looking at this is also looking at how these different layers might nest. So in the smallest circle, we might be looking at how do we reconfigure system structures and flows. And in the case of Meta, we've been looking at how do we implement water smart infrastructure. But the next level out asks questions around how do we shift power dynamics? How do we shift the patterns of how we organize? How do we evolve our relationships? And I think this is where it's been really interesting to see what has taken to really shift the uptake of these recommendations and approaches in terms of the approaches of different banks, of national organizations, state departments. What did they need? And there has been a significant reconfiguration. I cannot underestimate, the difference in worldview from seeing the road as, something that, you must shift water off as soon as possible, to then saying, no, we can use road infrastructure to actually harvest water. It's a very big, if you're an engineer, that is a very big shift in perception. Again, taking another step back, you're looking at the whole system goals. So how are we scaling low-cost water harvesting, and how are we tackling water insecurity? And perhaps, and I don't like banding about this word lightly, the word paradigm, but I do think there is something about the fundamental way in which we relate to water. So how do we shift from seeing water as damaging to seeing water as life-giving? And we grapple with this condition in terms of the role of water and the role of water in climate resilience, and how we kind of go between these two conditions of either having too much water or having too little water, and the fundamental challenge that we have when it comes to intervening to support and shift these two conditions. And perhaps I will